Hi, my name is Marc Herbst. I'd like to thank you all for attending my lecture and thank the Red Cross and Red Crescent Museum for this very interesting context of a paper. Um, I will be first introducing the paper, then turning on some slides, and yeah, and sit back and enjoy. This presentation looks at how contemporary art supports a dissociative cultural system that prioritizes fractured social and ecological relations and thus is at best structurally blind to humanitarian crises. It then points to ways in which artistic and cultural work actually confronts such disassociation within both crisis situations, but also within normal audience and art situations. I present a totalizing narrative connecting the development of a Western philosophy that grounds art history to systems at the heart of global humanitarian crises. Global imbalances in power that make weaker people essentially ineligible to determine the terms under which they can meaningfully live and die. That is, a global order grounded on colonial dispossession and its particular sexism and racisms. Critical of this world, I nevertheless do not think of anything as a closed book, and that the world around us does show that the good comes with the bad. So while I would say that on the whole, art is no check on global capitalism and governance's failures, I know this is just one story about art and that there are other stories to tell about creativity and culture's capacities. Okay, I'm going to start sharing my slides now. Okay, and then open up my paper again. Dominant governance regimes, capitalism, sexism, and a bias for modern organizing structures has created a climate where humanitarian crisis seems to emerge out of nowhere and can be characterized as being more complex than they appear at first sight. In fact, all the different ways humans live are complex, whether we talk about indigenous and others who live in close contact with complex natural ecologies, or relatively wealthy Western people who simply live at the end of an incredibly complex logistical chain. The fact of modern life allows for distant lands and distant situations to just seemingly appear, as they do when we go to the market and get bananas from a plantation in El Salvador, and how we can easily Google pictures of those plantations. This ease does a lot to construct the non-sensibility of humanitarian situations. In their 2020 CARE manifesto, the CARE Collective write that the dependencies we have on others locally and globally are veiled by the capitalist idea of autonomy that values a male-coded ability to be totally careless and to ignore all who you pay and count on to support your lifestyle. For art's sake, we can find odd ways that Enlightenment philosophy is strangely concurrent with this perspective. In his Critique of Aesthetic Judgment essay that I was taught as a grounding document of Western aesthetic theory, Immanuel Kant prioritizes disinterested contemplation as the ideal way to consider what is beautiful. He counterposes his position against an Iroquois holy person's concept of beauty. He has the Iroquois sachem considering beauty to be what is the most useful or the most satisfying. Kant wants beauty to be something removed from any aspect of what is necessary or physically pleasing. He asks us to disassociate from our centered perception when we contemplate the world and its relations and embrace as beautiful some esoteric political construct as a governing aesthetic concept. Concurrently, throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, scientists and philosophers had joined or followed colonial excursions to map not only the earth, but also to study the plants and minerals and the humans who use them. Encyclopedias were revised to include new species and to remove folk knowledges which had once been considered a part of what was also an essential part of how one should know nature. Instead, essential knowledge became that which could be repeatedly verified by male Europeans in the decontextualized laboratory. Friedrich Hegel's 19th century appreciation of a religious sculpture is instructive for how knowledge, beauty, and meaning became entangled in a sense of contextless abstraction. Here, describing how the sculptor achieves beauty by quote unquote stripping off the branches of root, stripping off the traces of root, branches, and leaves, still adhering to the form, and purifies the latter into shapes in which the crystals, straight lines, and flat surfaces are raised to incommensurable ratios, so that of understanding and, at the same time, its essential nature, incommensurability, is preserved for the understanding. By the 20th century, with the world mapped and colonial empires falling away, Western military force has seemingly receded as global corporations dominate trade routes into every interior. What remains is dispossessed people or structures that normalize dispossession in the name of companies and logistics and connections to global law. Laws that are never able to end the use of, for example, Congolese rare earth metals and blood diamonds, despite the fact that the police and courts are funded and held up as models for civilization. Post-colonial scholars note that besides this violence and laws are knowledges and cultural systems that devalue other ways of knowing and being in this world besides. Environmental historian Jason W. Moore describes our capitalist system, saying that like any other life-supporting system, it works through nature to fulfill human need. As an ecological historian, he traces how humans have exchanged with one another and with the natural world since forever. Images, objects, and ideas, that is, cultural expressions, have helped establish and maintain these relationships transhistorically. Quoting Moore, the economy and the environment are not independent of each other. Capitalism is not an economic system. It is not a social system. It is a way of organizing nature. Moore recognizes that what is unique about our time is that we act as though humans are outside of nature. It is almost as though Kant's ideas have affected our total worldview. Something has normalized the idea that we can be without paying any real ecological or social costs. This disconnectedness from the real world, a general lack of appreciating life's actually necessary central relationships with others, and an assumption that profit meets our needs, are some of the systemic causes of humanitarian crises. Art has a difficult time meaningfully intervening in this situation, and especially when it does not challenge these systemic terms. Photographer Sebastião Salgado's work is described in this way. Salgado's straightforward photographs portray individuals living in desperate economic circumstances. Salgado achieves a difficult task. His photographs impart the dignity and integrity of his subjects without forcing their heroism or implicitly soliciting pity. But everything, including interpretation, is particular and contextual. Without reading this text, any viewer's takeaway from this sort of image is up for grabs. Art is no better at interpreting or educating than any other cultural way of explaining the world. We know that climate change is somehow real, having read about it somehow being a cause for the recent Syrian civil war or all those migrants moving north from Central America. But we are still somehow not able to grasp that people live in actual exchange with everything around them, not just the bank and tax collector. This is important because it is these actual logistical systems we look through when we Google Salvadoran banana plantation. The abstract and real sense that we can organize nature without cost is made of plantations and mines, police, harbors and ports, trains, deep sea cables, but also the cultural idea that art is just a nice or meaningful thing, and culture, which is meaningful because that's what it is. Fine art benefits from the myth that that it can uniquely change our understanding of the world. But in our abstract world, art is just a programmed space we can point to and say, look at art for meaning. In this way, it is a placeholder for felt misunderstanding, a desire for something more that only sometimes works. Theories that ground Western art suggest that its meanings are abstract and essentially universal, but everything is contextual. Much of what we call art is displayed at the end of a chain of mistakes, bad judgment, greed, and ill will that has been allowed to happen. To expect that this art can be impactful is to expect that a hand can easily catch a bullet. Because of our unreal appreciation of how we live, we have an unreal appreciation of our own lives and how it is that lives are structured. Communities rely on each other, and the more than human world, communities rely on each other and the more than human world for stability and flexibility they need to manage their affairs. This is ecological relation. Art can provide us a way to recognize the human ways in which we relate to each other as individual biological beings and an ecological exchange. When art can open us to ourselves and the world in ways that situate us as something other than passive viewers, it can situate meaning in the hungry, precarious, and sensuous body, rather than in some weirdly abstract world mind that Hegel suggests. Brazilian artist Ligia Clark, let me just make sure that the slide is there. Brazilian artist Ligia Clark's wearable sculpture, Mascara, her wearable sculpture helps focus the wearer's senses and highlights the interactiveness of human being. This work's effects are individual. It works intimately and a passive viewer misses out from the experience of actually wearing the contraption. To wear this work, or any artwork that asks us to really hear, smell, touch, see differently and play, is to feel something. While this kind of work has little to do with interventions in the political sphere and does nothing to address humanitarian problems, when paired with critical analysis, it can more reliably convey a sense of our individual actual being in the contingent world. Large-scale crisis can occur when, because of race, gender, poverty, or ways of being, humans deny others the right to manage their own affairs. Art can connect us to the general humanity of being in a variety of ways. For example, in the 1970s, feminist sound artist Paulina Oliveros began to create a music and art practice known as deep listening. In deep listening, attention is directed to the, I'm quoting here, attention is directed to the interplay of sound and silences, or the sound-silence continuum. Sound is not limited to musical or speaking sounds, but is inclusive of all perceptible vibrations, where the perception of sound is understood to include the whole space-time continuum of sound, encountering the vastness and complexities as much as possible. Deep listening is an aesthetic practice made by modernist artists that have been utilized as an expansive socio-political practice. Other artists have used it as a method to deeply listen, to join with others, to deeply focus on the mundane but very real infrastructures that structure our lives. For example, through artist-led walks in the city, and to actually hear what we have built all around us. But beyond the confines of museum viewership, or short-term engagements with cultural activity that can be left behind, there are artists and cultural workers that meaningfully collaborate within crisis situations. The sort of cultural work here that I'm interested is often partisan, as it finds its way to do meaningful work in conflicted and difficult situations. crisis situations offer people in crisis their dilemma to learn from, and the possibility to co-organize ways out of it if allowed to do so. Artists and cultural workers can collaborate with people in crisis to stabilize precarious communities by providing space for needed interactions. Under both liberal and right-wing government, Denmark has incredibly stringent migration policy and houses refugee and asylum seekers far from population centers, minimizing their chances for cultural integration and maximizing mental health issues. Trampoline House was founded in Copenhagen as a place for foreigners and Danish residents to interact on a personal level, as a needed social outlet for refugees and Danes, as a way to generally transform Danish society, and to challenge, on the political level, racist narratives that dehumanize all migrants. Some of the asylum seekers that experienced Trampoline House fled the Syrian revolution that began in 2011. In northern Syria, following decades of oppression, Kurds and other peoples declared a free state to be governed under anarcho-syndicalist and feminist concepts. Within the context of this crisis, they took territory and have managed it as a precarious but autonomously governed state with roughly 2 million residents. Dutch artist Jonas Staal funneled money from the Dutch Mondrian Fund for Arts to collaborate with the territory to design and build their parliament. Following the Trump administration's selling out of the Kurds in 2019, the commune was attacked by Turkish forces, and the fate of the multicultural democratic state is made even more unsure. But Stahl's collaboration has provided a culturally significant place where its residents have an opportunity to politically stabilize their community and possibly manage their affairs in open and democratic ways. But cultural workers have done more than provide shelter, housing, and cover for governing systems. Cultural work has the ability to create and entirely reimagine the terms under which displaced communities approach their living. This sort of work is culturally innovative in the sense that it crafts totally new ways to relate to the human and more than human world through cultural expressions, often with theological and political components. For example, the late 19th century Native American shaman named Wovoka hybridized indigenous spirituality and Christianity to create the ghost dance. The dance was spread by the new rail system in the American West, which was completed at the end of the country's colonial expansion. The dance created a new pan-native cultural expression. Though a peace movement under particular terms, Indigenous historian Nick Estes described it in this way. The ghost dance, in the revolutionary sense, was about life, not death. It was about imagining and enacting an anti-colonial indigenous future free from the death world brought on by settler invasion. The dance form, its music and costumes, were co-invented by its practitioners in order to convey, in really meaningful ways, a redefinition of human being. Quoting again, the leader beat time and sang, and the people danced going round to the left in a sidewise step. They danced without rest, on, and they got out of breath, but still they kept going as long as possible. Occasionally, someone, thoroughly exhausted and dizzy, fell unconscious into the center and lay there, dead. After a while, many lay about in that condition. They were now dead and seeing their dear ones. As each one came to, woke up, she or he slowly sat up and looked about, bewildered. Had the dance been allowed to flourish, scholars suggest that North American indigenous communities may have been able to reinvent lifeways and avoid the multiple crises that indigenous communities have lived through, from the violent encounters at the end of the Plain Wars up until today. In closing, in the light of the coming climate-based dispossessions, I would suggest that there are artists and cultural workers collaborating with communities to meaningfully remake values in variable, radical ways that stick, and in relationship to the wider world, that can avoid the development of humanitarian crises by reigniting and redirecting how we meaningfully organize life and the ways and means of living together. So I'm going to stop share and say thank you for listening, and I'm excited to take on and answer any questions. Thank you.